Daniel wandered down the empty road, his breath shallow and his steps hesitant. The fog wrapped around him, thick and unyielding, obscuring the world just a few feet ahead. It was cold, far colder than it had been earlier in the evening, and an eerie silence filled the air, amplifying every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by the faintest sound, distant, haunting, the unmistakable notes of a calliope. The music drifted through the fog, carried by an invisible wind, its melancholic tune twisting like a dark lullaby. Daniel froze, his heart pounding as the strange melody beckoned him forward. As he walked closer, a peculiar glow pierced the fog, revealing what seemed to be an old, crumbling circus tent. Red and gold stripes lined the tent, though the colors had long since faded, washed out by time and neglect. Strings of dim, yellowed lights hung around the perimeter, flickering erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. He took a step forward, feeling a strange pull, an unnatural magnetism that drew him in, even as every instinct screamed to turn back. The air felt heavier here, almost thick, and the smell of damp earth mingled with something sweet, the unmistakable scent of stale cotton candy and popcorn, tainted with a metallic undertone. The silence returned, oppressive, filling the empty spaces between the tents. The place seemed deserted, lifeless, yet every nerve in Daniel's body sensed otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, where the outlines of old carnival attractions loomed. A rusted Ferris wheel, its seats swaying ever so slightly, and a carousel with chipped horses frozen in grotesque poses, their hollow eyes glinting in the faint light. One horse, larger than the others, had its mouth open in a silent scream, its teeth bared in a way that made Daniel's stomach turn. He walked further into the eerie encampment, passing by empty stalls where faded signs advertised forgotten delights. Fortunes told, laughs guaranteed, the amazing knife thrower. Each sign seemed more ominous than the last, the bold letters twisted and cracked, as if time itself had tried to erase them. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see anyone, watching him from the darkness. But all he saw were the unmoving shadows, watching him back. Then, he saw it. A mirror, cracked and leaning against an old wooden frame, stood near the entrance of one of the larger tents. His reflection looked back at him, yet something about it felt wrong. It was him, yet not him. The reflection's eyes seemed darker, almost hollow, and a smirk played on its lips that sent a chill down his spine. He blinked, and the smirk was gone, replaced by his own frightened expression. Shaken, he tore his gaze away from the mirror, but the unease remained, settling deep in his bones. Inside the main tent, the air grew colder, and Daniel's footsteps echoed in the cavernous silence. Rows of empty seats surrounded a dusty ring, where faint outlines in the dirt hinted at past performances. A solitary spotlight shone dimly on the center of the ring, illuminating a single, oversized clown doll. Its face was painted in a grotesque grin, lips smeared in crimson, eyes wide and unblinking. As he stepped closer, he could swear he heard the faintest sound, like a whisper or a breath escaping the doll's painted lips. The music started again, louder this time, and more dissonant, as if the notes themselves were twisted, broken. It echoed around him, reverberating through the tent, pressing down on him with an invisible weight. And then, the whisper returned, clearer now, coming from all directions, as if the walls themselves were murmuring. "Welcome, we've been waiting for you." Daniel stepped further into the darkened depths of the circus tent, every muscle tense, every nerve tingling with dread. Shadows danced around him as the flickering lights outside cast erratic, ghostly shapes along the walls. His fingers brushed against the old, musty fabric, and he was struck by an odd familiarity, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It gnawed at him, like an itch at the back of his mind, a memory clawing its way to the surface, but just out of reach. As he continued, he stumbled upon a small booth covered in dust, its once bright, paint peeling in jagged strips. On the counter, half buried under layers of grime, lay a strange object, a small, weathered toy car. He hesitated, staring at it, as a chill crept down his spine. The toy was painfully familiar. It was the same kind he'd played with as a child, though he had long forgotten about it. A memory surfaced, him as a young boy, clutching that very toy while standing in front of a circus tent just like this one. He'd been here before. The realization sent a wave of nausea over him. How could he have forgotten? The air grew thick, and as he clutched the toy in his hand, the surrounding noises seemed to fade. The music softened into a distant, distorted lullaby, and a new sound filled the air, a faint, childlike giggle echoing from somewhere in the shadows. His heart raced as he scanned the tent, but there was no one there, only shadows that seemed to grow darker, denser. Then he heard it again, closer this time, a whisper, "Come play, Danny." The voice was achingly familiar, filled with a warmth that made his skin crawl. It reminded him of his childhood, of nights filled with laughter that had long since turned to nightmares. His gaze fell back to the toy in his hand, and as he turned it over, he noticed something scratched into the paint. His own initials. DB. Horror washed over him as he realized this was his toy, the very one he'd lost on that fateful night so many years ago. He'd buried the memory, forced himself to forget the circus, the clowns, the twisted illusions that had haunted his dreams for years. But now, standing in the eerie silence, he couldn't deny the truth. He was back. A cold wind swept through the tent, carrying with it a faint, bitter scent of ash and charred wood. Daniel's memories flooded back in fragmented flashes of fire, chaos, the piercing sound of terrified screams. He remembered watching in horror as the circus tent went up in flames, trapped on the outside, while his best friend, a boy named Jacob, had been caught inside. No one had survived that night, or so he'd been told. Yet here he was, holding a piece of his past, in a place that shouldn't exist. It felt like the dead were whispering, calling him back to face what he had long tried to forget. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind him. He whipped around, his breath caught in his throat, and saw the silhouette of a figure lurking just beyond the edge of the light. It was small, childlike, and familiar, but wrong. The figure's head cocked to the side, and in a voice that sent a shock of terror through his veins, it called out, "Do you remember me, Danny?" The words were soft, innocent, yet laced with something dark, something that felt impossibly old. Daniel's knees went weak as he realized it was Jacob, or at least something that looked like him, something twisted by the years, by whatever dark forces haunted this cursed place. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet as Jacob's figure took a step forward. His face was obscured by shadows, but Daniel could see the faint glint of eyes watching him, unblinking and cold. "You left me," the figure whispered, its voice now a blend of accusation and sorrow, echoing with a hollow emptiness that clawed at Daniel's soul. "You promised you'd come back for me." In that moment, the tent seemed to close in around him. The walls stretched and pulsed as if they were alive, breathing with his fear. The shadows grew darker, more menacing, and the air felt thick with the weight of guilt and dread. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stumbled back toward the entrance. But no matter how far he ran, he felt trapped, as if the tent had expanded into a maze that twisted and turned endlessly. Daniel's chest heaved as he backed away from the figure in the shadows, his mind spinning in a chaotic mix of fear and guilt. Every corner of the tent seemed to whisper his name, accusing him, taunting him for the night he had tried so hard to forget. But the figure, the twisted image of his friend Jacob, wasn't merely a haunting memory. It was something else, something alive and angry, bound to the darkness of this place. The tent was suffocating, as if the air itself were thickening, refusing to let him leave. Then, as if sensing his desperation, the figure stepped forward, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "Danny," the voice called out, gentler now, almost coaxing. "There's only one way to leave." Jacob's face twisted into a mockery of a smile, cold and hollow as he raised his hand, holding out an object that gleamed faintly. In his small, pale hand lay a shard of a broken mirror, sharp and jagged, reflecting Daniel's terrified gaze back at him. He felt a pull, an urge he couldn't resist, as if the mirror held the answer, but he knew deep down that nothing about this was salvation. The figure's voice became softer, almost pleading. "Take it, Danny. You have to choose." The choice wasn't simply about leaving. Daniel could feel it, like a dark weight pressing on his soul. The mirror wasn't a path to freedom, but a twisted key, demanding a sacrifice. He sensed three options clawing at his mind, each one darker than the last, each threatening to pull him further into the nightmare that had once been his life. The first choice lingered, haunting and gut-wrenching. He could sever the memory of Jacob, erasing every moment they had shared, the laughter, the promises, even the bond they once thought unbreakable. It would mean abandoning his friend a second time, leaving him to the darkness of the Midnight Circus without a trace of remembrance. But he knew that losing those memories would be like losing a piece of his soul. The thought twisted inside him, ripping at the edges of his sanity. Then came the second choice, equally chilling. The figure's hand shifted, and Daniel felt a sensation unlike any he'd known, the promise of merging with the darkness itself, allowing the circus's evil to seep into him, to bind him to this cursed ground. It would mean he could stay, to become a guardian of sorts, ensuring that no other child suffered Jacob's fate. But the price would be immense. He would become part of the nightmare, his life drained, his body and mind twisted into a specter like Jacob, neither dead nor alive. A cold shiver of horror crept down his spine as he pictured himself trapped forever, watching helplessly as the circus claimed others. The final choice was the darkest, a desperate gamble against time and sanity. He could sacrifice a piece of his mind, allowing the darkness to consume part of his memories, to take away his understanding of reality. It would offer him a way out, perhaps, but he would return to the world shattered, haunted by memories he could no longer piece together, chased by whispers only he could hear. He would be free, but hollow, fragmented, and alone. The idea filled him with dread, a fear so deep it nearly brought him to his knees. The figure, still resembling Jacob, stepped closer, and Daniel felt its cold hand reach out, pressing the shard of glass into his palm. "Choose, Danny," it whispered, a twisted echo of the friendship they once had. "Choose, or be lost here forever." Daniel's hand trembled as he gripped the shard, its edges cutting into his skin, drawing thin lines of blood. Every instinct screamed at him to let go, to drop the mirror and run, but he knew there was no escaping the circus without facing the choice. The tent around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, the walls closing in, shadows deepening as if waiting for his decision. His mind raced, each option tearing at him with the weight of guilt and fear, his vision blurring as he struggled to breathe. He knew that no matter what he chose, a part of him would be forever trapped here, bound to the Midnight Circus in one way or another. He looked up at the figure, at the ghostly face of his childhood friend twisted by time and sorrow, and he knew there was no way out that would leave him whole. Taking a shaky breath, he prepared to choose, feeling the darkness press around him, eager, hungry, waiting for him to surrender. The moment Daniel made his choice, a chill swept through the tent, deeper and more unnatural than any he had felt before. The air grew dense, pressing against him as if the very fabric of the Midnight Circus was alive, breathing, and aware of his presence. Shadows crawled across the ground, stretching and contorting, forming shapes that flickered at the edge of his vision. Every instinct told him to run, but he felt rooted to the spot, trapped by an unseen force that clung to his very skin. It was as if the darkness had fingers, wrapping around him, pulling him further into its depths. A faint whisper echoed around him, soft and insidious, slithering through the air like a poisonous mist. The words were just out of reach, foreign, yet strangely familiar, as if spoken by a voice he once knew but could no longer remember. It called his name, Daniel, dragging out each syllable with a slow, deliberate malice. His blood ran cold, and he turned sharply, expecting to see someone lurking behind him. But there was nothing. Only shadows, thick and shifting, pressing closer with each second. As he strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices overlapping one another. They were angry, mournful, pleading. A choir of lost souls trapped within the circus walls, bound to this dark place by whatever malevolent force controlled it. "Help us, find us, free us," the voices called, mingling with soft, breathless laughter that sent a shiver down his spine. Each whisper seemed to echo from different corners of the tent, creating the illusion that he was surrounded, trapped in a circle of invisible, despairing spirits. Suddenly, the shadows began to ripple, like waves on a dark, bottomless sea, and he felt something brushing against his skin, cold and insubstantial. He could barely see them, but there were faint shapes, spectral figures with hollow eyes and twisted mouths, their translucent hands reaching out, grazing his shoulders, his arms, leaving trails of icy numbness in their wake. He backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but the shadows followed, shifting with him, closing the gap. It was as if the tent itself was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that thrived on his fear, feeding off the terror that radiated from him like heat. One of the shadows moved closer, and he caught a glimpse of a face, pale, emaciated, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly from within. It was Jacob, or what remained of him, twisted into something unrecognizable. The apparition's mouth moved, lips cracking open as it whispered again, "You left me. You let me burn." The words sent a bolt of horror through Daniel, each syllable dripping with pain and betrayal. His mind raced, guilt clawing at him, but he couldn't look away. The face was a grotesque reminder of the past he had tried so hard to bury, the sin he had hoped would fade with time. But here, in the heart of the Midnight Circus, there was no escape from his guilt. The whispers grew louder, blending into a single, harrowing chant that filled the tent. The words twisted and shifted, taking on forms that felt foreign yet familiar, seeping into his mind and scraping against his sanity. He could hear his own name mixed with words of accusation, words of vengeance, as if the very walls of the tent held grudges, as if the ground beneath his feet thirsted for retribution. "You belong to us now," they hissed, their voices growing darker, deeper, until they felt like physical blows, pounding against his chest. Desperate, Daniel stumbled back, pressing his hands over his ears, trying to block out the relentless whispers, but they only grew louder, filling his mind with images he couldn't ignore. He saw flames engulfing the circus, felt the searing heat, heard the agonized screams of those trapped within. He saw himself as a child, standing frozen with fear as the tent burned, too terrified to help, too selfish to stay. The visions blurred, melding into one another, and he could no longer tell where reality ended and the nightmares began. The shadows began to tighten around him, like a vice closing in, their ghostly hands clawing at him, each touch icy, leaving a prickling numbness that spread through his limbs. He could feel the darkness seeping into him, cold and unforgiving, like tendrils of smoke worming their way beneath his skin. His pulse quickened, his body trembling with the sensation of being consumed, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than an echo within the Midnight Circus, another whisper in the shadows. In the distance, he thought he saw a light, faint and flickering, like a beacon, but he couldn't reach it. The shadows blocked his path, their whispers growing louder, mocking him, taunting him with every step. He stumbled forward, fighting the invisible hands that pulled at him, struggling to break free. But each step felt heavier, each breath more labored, as if the circus itself were absorbing him, drawing him into its eternal, twisted embrace. As he sank to his knees, the whispers closed in, suffocating him in a blanket of despair and darkness. He was part of the Midnight Circus now, bound to its secrets, another lost soul in the shadows. And as his vision faded, he heard the voices one last time, a chorus of the damned, whispering a final, haunting message. "Welcome home, Daniel. Daniel's breathing was shallow, his chest tightening with each step as he forced himself to move deeper into the shadow-laden maze of the Midnight Circus. The whispers had faded, but a new terror settled over him. A silence so profound it pressed down on him like an invisible weight, filling his mind with a suffocating dread. Every corner he turned felt like entering a trap, every flicker of light like the watching eye of something unspeakable, lurking just out of sight. It was as if the circus itself had been waiting for this moment, eager to peel back the layers of his fear and reveal the depths of his vulnerability. As he crept through the twisting corridors, he began to see things, or thought he did. Shadows moved along the edges of his vision, shapes that dissolved the moment he looked directly at them. Faces flickered in the darkness, familiar and yet horribly distorted, like half-formed memories clawing their way back from the grave. His senses betrayed him, each sound amplified, each silence unbearable. His hands trembled as he gripped a tattered tent fabric for support, the rough material scratching against his fingers, grounding him to the present, yet somehow making him feel even more trapped. The first true vision struck him like a blow. As he reached a clearing at the heart of the circus, a towering mirror stood before him, its glass cracked and smeared with dust, reflecting not his image, but a twisted, monstrous version of himself. His face was contorted in agony, eyes wide with a terror he had yet to feel, mouth stretched into a scream that echoed only in his mind. He stumbled back, nearly falling, but something in the mirror's dark reflection called to him, pulling him into its haunting depths. He couldn't look away, transfixed by the grotesque caricature staring back at him. His own face seemed to morph, shifting into expressions of horror he didn't recognize, expressions that seemed to belong to another version of himself, one that had already faced what lay ahead and had been broken by it. The reflection began to speak, though its lips didn't move. A voice, low and sinister, filled his mind, like thoughts that weren't his own. "You can't escape," it whispered, the words seeping into his mind like poison. "You think you're different, that you're stronger." They all think that at first. The voice trailed off into a soft, mocking laugh, chilling and hollow, as if mocking his very existence. Suddenly, images began flashing across the surface of the mirror, visions of his worst fears come to life, each more grotesque and surreal than the last. He saw himself lost in a maze with no end, his hands bloody as he clawed at walls that only grew higher, tighter, suffocating him. He saw faces of people he once knew, loved ones twisted and hollowed, their eyes accusing, mouths whispering curses he couldn't bear to hear. Each vision struck him with a visceral dread, chipping away at his sanity, his courage, his will to fight. Desperately, he tore his gaze from the mirror, only to find himself surrounded by walls that seemed to breathe, pulsing in rhythm with his panicked heartbeat. The entire tent seemed alive, sentient, feeding on his fear, thriving on the chaos within him. His footsteps echoed in the empty, winding corridors, but no matter how far he ran, every path seemed to lead him back to that mirror, back to the twisted version of himself, waiting, watching with darkened eyes that glinted with malevolent glee. He began to hear voices, his own voice, twisted and fractured, taunting him, accusing him, filling his mind with doubts and horrors he thought he had long buried. "You'll never escape," the voice repeated, a relentless mantra that grew louder with each repetition, like a drumbeat in the depths of his skull. "You'll die here. Like the others, another soul for the Midnight Circus." The words became a maddening chant, echoing around him, warping into screams that twisted his mind, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. The circus began to play tricks on his senses, warping his perception until he could no longer trust his own eyes. Doors appeared where there were none, leading to rooms filled with horrors he could barely comprehend. A laughing audience of empty-eyed clowns, an endless hallway lined with mirrors that reflected not his image, but twisted versions of his loved ones, their faces marred with fear and hatred. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on him, shrinking his world to a claustrophobic nightmare from which he could find no escape. Daniel felt his resolve crumbling, his mind unraveling, as the circus revealed his deepest, most hidden fears, feeding on them, twisting them into shapes that haunted every corner of his vision. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, desperate to block out the voices, the visions, the endless echoes of his own failures and fears. The terror clawed at him, relentless, pulling him deeper, urging him to surrender, to give himself fully to the circus. In his mind, he could hear one final, insidious whisper, a temptation that resonated with his deepest despair. Give in, Daniel. Just let go. Let the fear consume you, and it will all be over. It was a seductive promise, the offer of peace wrapped in the dark allure of oblivion. He could feel the weight of the circus pressing down, a malevolent presence hungry for his soul, waiting for him to succumb. The choice lingered, tempting him, pulling him ever closer to the darkness that pulsed within the Midnight Circus. And as he knelt there, alone, surrounded by shadows and specters, he realized that the circus had always known his fears, and it had been waiting, patiently, for him to give in. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds as he staggered forward, each step heavier than the last. The shadows tightened around him, stretching into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock him, writhing like specters just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel the circus closing in, an entity all its own, feeding off his fear, his desperation, his regrets. In the center of the tent, bathed in the dim, flickering light, stood a figure draped in darkness, a commanding presence that exuded a chilling, ancient malice. It was the ringmaster, or whatever creature had taken on that guise, a twisted overseer of this macabre realm, eyes glinting with an unnatural hunger. The ringmaster wore a cracked porcelain mask, its painted smile stretching too wide, unnatural and lifeless, a grin that seemed to pierce Daniel's very soul. The eyes behind the mask gleamed, cold and knowing, as if they could see through him, unearthing every secret, every sin he'd buried deep. Daniel's chest tightened as he realized he couldn't look away, couldn't move, as though the very gaze of the ringmaster had paralyzed him. The creature lifted a gloved hand, pointing one long, skeletal finger toward him, and in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "Daniel," it purred, each syllable a slow, dreadful drawl. "Welcome back. We've been waiting for you." The ringmaster's voice echoed with a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the vast emptiness around him. Daniel's mind reeled as fragments of memory surfaced, flashing through his thoughts like shards of glass. His last night at the circus, the fire, the screaming faces, the helpless feeling of watching Jacob disappear into the flames. He'd tried to forget, tried to bury it, but the circus had never let go. "You left us, Daniel," the ringmaster continued, its voice laced with mock sorrow. "You abandoned your friend, turned your back on us. But we never forgot you." The words struck him like a physical blow, tearing open wounds he had thought were long healed. Guilt twisted inside him, sharp and unforgiving, as memories he'd forced into the dark came rushing back with a vengeance. He remembered the promises he'd made to Jacob, the childish vows of eternal friendship, promises he'd broken when fear overtook him. "Why did you run, Daniel?" the ringmaster taunted, taking a step forward, the ground beneath its feet seeming to ripple with each stride. "All you had to do was stay to help. But you chose yourself." The ringmaster gestured, and the shadows around him shifted, contorting into ghostly forms, their faces distorted by pain and sorrow. He recognized them, figures from his past, echoes of the night that had haunted his dreams. His heart raced as he saw Jacob among them, his face pale and twisted in agony, his eyes hollow, void of life. "Do you see them, Daniel?" the ringmaster whispered, its tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. "They've waited for you, all of them, and now you have a debt to pay." The shadows circled him, whispering his name, each voice layered with resentment and sorrow, a haunting chorus that echoed within his mind. He could feel their pain, their anger, their endless waiting, and he knew that this was his punishment, that he'd been called back here, to this place that had once been his wonderland and had become his nightmare. Daniel's hands shook as he looked into the face of his former friend, the face twisted by bitterness and betrayal. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I was just a kid. I was scared." But the words felt hollow, futile, lost in the emptiness that surrounded him. Jacob's ghostly figure tilted its head, watching him with eyes that held no forgiveness, no mercy, only an empty, all-consuming despair. The ringmaster stepped closer, until it towered over him, a dark, ominous shadow, its presence as heavy as a storm about to break. "Words won't save you here, Daniel," it sneered, its voice low and cold. "You want forgiveness? Then prove it." With a flourish of its hand, the ringmaster presented him with an old, rusted key, dangling from a chain that looked worn and ancient. "Unlock the heart of the circus," it intoned, its voice reverberating with a sinister glee. "Face the truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, you may find absolution." Daniel hesitated, his fingers reaching out to take the key, but his hand trembled. He knew that whatever lay ahead would force him to confront his darkest memories, to relive the horror that had shattered his life all those years ago. But he also knew he had no choice. The circus would not release him until he faced his own guilt, his own betrayal. With a deep, shuddering breath, he took the key, feeling its cold weight in his hand, a weight that pressed down on his soul. As he turned toward the door that had appeared before him, the shadows parted, revealing a passage that seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with mirrors that reflected not his present self, but versions of him from every stage of his life. A frightened child, a reckless teenager, a man burdened by regrets. Each reflection whispered his name, pleading, mocking, reminding him of every failure, every misstep. He walked forward, his heart pounding, the weight of his past pressing down with each step. The mirrors distorted, shifting to reveal scenes of the circus on fire, children screaming, hands reaching out for help that never came. At the end of the hallway, he found another door, its surface scorched and cracked. Taking a steadying breath, he inserted the key and turned it, feeling a surge of dread as the door swung open, revealing the center of the circus, the charred, desolate remains of what had once been a place of joy and wonder. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and ash, and he could hear faint echoes of laughter, twisted and broken, mixing with the distant, haunting strains of circus music. In the center of the ruins stood a figure, cloaked in darkness, waiting for him. It was the spirit of the circus, the embodiment of all that had been lost, all that had been twisted by tragedy and neglect. As he stepped closer, the figure lifted its head, revealing a face that was both familiar and terrifying, a reflection of his own guilt, his own fear, his own failure. "You wanted to forget," it whispered, its voice filled with ancient sorrow. "But memories can't be erased. Not here. Not in the Midnight Circus." The spirit raised its hand, reaching out, and Daniel felt its cold grip around his heart, filling him with a pain that went beyond the physical, a pain that was rooted in his very soul. He knew, in that moment, that there was no escape from the truth, no running from the shadows he had left behind. The Midnight Circus had claimed him, and it would hold him until he could face the darkness within himself. As the spirit's gaze bore into him, he felt his own memories flooding back, a relentless wave of guilt, terror, and sorrow. And in the silent, endless darkness, he knew that this was his moment of truth, that the circus would either consume him, or he would find the strength to confront the shadows that had haunted him his entire life. The charred remains of the Midnight Circus loomed around Daniel, their twisted shapes casting long, grotesque shadows that danced with a life of their own. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a silence that thrummed with anticipation. Every nerve in his body screamed to turn back, to flee, but something held him there, a force beyond his control, urging him to face what he had long buried. In the center of the devastation, the ringmaster stood, its figure wreathed in darkness, an embodiment of everything malignant and ancient within the cursed circus. Its eyes, gleaming with malevolence, followed his every move, cold and unyielding. Daniel, the ringmaster, intoned, its voice like the rasp of rusted metal, scraping against his mind. You've wandered these grounds before, but tonight you are not a spectator. Tonight you are the performance. The words twisted in his mind, sharp and mocking, and he felt a shiver of dread ripple through him. His every fear, every memory he had tried to suppress, was rising to the surface, clawing its way into the present. This was no ordinary confrontation. It was a battle for his very soul, a struggle between the darkness that had haunted him and the faint spark of light that still clung to his being. In the ring around him, ghostly figures began to appear, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken and lifeless, yet each held a trace of familiarity. They were the souls of those who had once been part of the circus, lost, twisted remnants of the performers and children who had perished in the fire so many years ago. They encircled him, their forms flickering like dying embers, their eyes locked on him with an unspoken accusation. He saw Jacob among them, his face a mask of sorrow and betrayal, his gaze fixed on Daniel with a mixture of anger and despair. The ringmaster extended a gloved hand, pointing at Daniel as the shadows closed in. "You brought this upon yourself, Daniel," it sneered. "Your fear, your guilt, they are the chains that bind you here." It took a step forward, the ground seeming to tremble beneath its weight, as if the very earth was recoiling from its presence. "Tonight, you will face the price of your cowardice, the weight of your sins. There is no escape, only atonement." The shadows surged around him, their hands reaching out, cold and insubstantial, yet each touch sent a wave of paralyzing fear through his body. He could feel their pain, their anger, the bitterness of lives cut short, and he knew he had to face this darkness, to confront the weight of his guilt. But how could he possibly atone for something so monstrous, so deeply rooted in his soul? His gaze met Jacob's, and he saw a glimmer of something beyond anger in those hollow eyes, a plea, a spark of the friendship they had once shared. It was then that he understood. He couldn't run from this, couldn't fight it with fear or anger. He had to confront it with acceptance, to take responsibility for his past, for the choices he had made, and the lives that had been lost. Trembling, he stepped forward, reaching out to the apparition of his friend. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, raw and unfiltered. "I was scared. I didn't know how to save you, how to save any of you. I ran because I couldn't face what was happening." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to hesitate, their relentless grip loosening, as if they, too, were waiting, listening. "But I'm here now. I'm not running anymore." The ringmaster laughed, a low, mocking sound that reverberated through the ruins. "Do you think words are enough, Daniel? Do you think a simple apology will undo what you've done?" It raised its arms, and the shadows surged forward, a torrent of darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. But Daniel held his ground, his eyes locked on Jacob's, refusing to look away, refusing to back down. With each step he took toward his friend, the shadows lashed at him, their cold touch seeping into his bones, sapping his strength. He could feel his mind fracturing, breaking under the weight of the darkness, but he pushed forward, fueled by a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. His hand reached out, trembling, as he placed it on Jacob's shoulder, feeling the icy chill of the ghostly figure beneath his touch. "I won't abandon you again," he whispered, the words a solemn vow that resonated deep within his soul. "If it means my life, my sanity, whatever price, I'll pay it. I won't leave you here alone." The shadows recoiled, their anguished wails filling the air as they began to dissipate, unraveling like smoke in the wind. The other spirits looked on, their faces softening, the hollow void in their eyes replaced with a faint glimmer of peace. One by one, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness, leaving only Jacob and the ringmaster, the latter's expression twisted with fury. The ringmaster's voice rose, a snarl that echoed through the empty night. "No, this isn't over. You belong to us, Daniel. You cannot escape the Midnight Circus. It lunged forward, a storm of shadows and malice. But Daniel held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "No," Daniel replied, his voice steady, filled with a quiet strength. "I don't belong to you. I belong to them, to my friend." He looked at Jacob, the shadow of his childhood companion, and saw a smile break through the sorrow, a final look of understanding, of forgiveness. With that, Jacob's figure began to dissolve, a soft light radiating from within him as he disappeared, finally free. The ringmaster let out a piercing scream, its form flickering, destabilizing, as the circus around them began to collapse. The tents, the twisted rides, the mirrors, all shuddered and cracked, the Midnight Circus crumbling as its power waned. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, and he stumbled, the darkness lifting, replaced by a blinding light that engulfed everything. When he opened his eyes, he found himself standing alone in an empty field, the remnants of the circus nowhere to be seen. The air was still, silent, filled only with the faint scent of earth and grass. He looked around, feeling an unfamiliar lightness. The weight of his guilt lifted, replaced with a sense of peace. He knew the Midnight Circus was gone, its curse broken, its spirits freed. But as he walked away, he felt a chill brush against him, a soft whisper on the wind that sent a final shiver down his spine. Until next time, Daniel emerged from the field, his heart still racing, every inch of his body tense and battered from his ordeal in the Midnight Circus. The world around him felt different, lighter, quieter, yet something about the stillness was unsettling. It was as if reality itself held its breath, watching him, waiting. He took a few shaky steps forward, feeling the grass beneath his feet, grounding him in the here and now. But as he looked back, expecting to see an empty field where the circus had once stood, his breath caught. There, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of something flickering in the darkness. A faint glow, barely perceptible, like the remnants of distant carnival lights. He blinked, and the lights vanished, leaving only shadows stretching across the field. A chill crept down his spine. It was gone. He had freed Jacob, released the trapped souls, and faced his past. But then, why did it feel as though the Midnight Circus wasn't entirely finished with him? Shaking off the lingering dread, Daniel started to walk away, determined to leave the haunted memories behind. Yet the silence around him fell heavy, almost oppressive, as if the night itself carried secrets he couldn't escape. His mind wandered, replaying the final moments of his encounter with the ringmaster, that chilling laugh, the whispered promise that echoed even now. Until next time, it was a threat, a vow that lingered in the dark corners of his thoughts, refusing to let him go. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, the night air growing colder, despite the absence of wind. As he walked, he felt a strange urge to look at his reflection. Almost involuntarily, his eyes drifted to a nearby puddle, and what he saw made his heart skip. In the rippling water, his reflection stared back at him, but there was something wrong, something subtly twisted. His eyes seemed darker, his face gaunt, almost hollow, like a distorted mirror of his true self. A faint, familiar smirk tugged at his reflection's lips, a cruel, knowing smile that was not his own. He stumbled back, tearing his gaze away, but the image was burned into his mind. It was as if a piece of the circus had followed him, lodged deep within him, a shadow he couldn't shake. Daniel pressed on, his pace quickening, but every shadow around him seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out with unseen hands. He could feel a presence, an awareness, lingering just beyond the edge of the darkness, watching him. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the faintest whisper, his name, carried on a breath of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. He stopped, his skin prickling with the unmistakable sense that he wasn't alone. Heart pounding, he forced himself to turn, half expecting to see the ringmaster standing there, grinning from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the empty field, quiet and still, yet filled with an unseen menace. As he continued, he noticed strange things. Faint echoes of circus music, barely audible, as if drifting on a breeze that he couldn't feel. Flickers of color at the corner of his eye, like glimpses of carnival lights that vanished the moment he turned to look. The road seemed longer, stretching impossibly, the path winding in ways that felt unnatural, looping back on itself, as if trying to keep him within the unseen grip of the circus. He shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread, but the feeling remained, gnawing at him, whispering that he had never truly left. In the distance, he spotted an old, weathered signpost, its paint faded and chipped. As he approached, he felt his stomach drop. The sign bore an image of the circus, the same Midnight Circus that had haunted his past, that he had just escaped. Beneath it were the words, "The Midnight Circus returns. One night only." His hands trembled as he reached out, touching the sign, its surface cold and rough beneath his fingers, as if it had been waiting for him, just like the circus itself. A hollow laugh echoed faintly in his mind, the ringmaster's voice chillingly familiar. "There is no escape, Daniel," it whispered, each word a dagger of fear sinking into his chest. "The circus is part of you now, as you are part of it. We will always find you." He pulled his hand back, breathless, feeling the weight of the ringmaster's words sink in. No matter where he went, how far he ran, the Midnight Circus had left its mark on him, a scar that would never fade. He looked around, the night seeming darker than before, as though the very shadows had deepened, closing in. Somewhere in the distance, a calliope played, its notes disjointed and haunting, drifting through the night like a ghostly lullaby. And in his heart, he knew this was not the end. The Midnight Circus was bound to him, a curse he would carry, a mystery that would follow him into every shadow, every silence, whispering promises of horror just out of reach. As he walked away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that invisible eyes tracked his every step. He could almost see them, faint glints in the darkness, like eyes peering out from the endless corridors of that cursed circus. And with every step, the haunting realization grew. He hadn't escaped. Not truly. The Midnight Circus would always be with him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment he let his guard down, ready to pull him back into its twisted embrace. With one last look over his shoulder, he quickened his pace, feeling the cold night press in around him. The circus was gone, for now, but the terror, the mystery, the curse, they remained, woven into the fabric of his reality, a haunting reminder that some nightmares never end.